Thank you very much. That was absolutely perfect and set the stage so well. We'll now move to Chen, who will indicate to us in her story that it didn't last that long.
Well, first of all, I want to wish all the sisters and brothers here a wonderful International Women's Day. And I want to say I'm really happy to be here because it's been many years since I've been able to participate in such a lively International Women's Day celebration. There were many of them when I was coming out of college, and at that time the modern day women's movement was beginning in the 1970s. And then working in the ILGWU, we had some really exciting celebrations with international women because they remember celebrating this occasion in their countries, which is honored as a time to really look at the status of women. So I'm really, really happy and excited to be here today, and to also remember the tough struggles of women, which are sometimes taken for granted, but in recent days have been shown on Channel 13 and in different movies, like even what women went through for the right to vote. And I want to thank the League of Women Voters and E-News and Carmelina and Addie from the Triangle Fire Coalition and everybody, because we shouldn't take those struggles for granted. I mean, women were beaten and died for these rights that we enjoy today, and it's a good time to really remember those sacrifices, including the sacrifice of those 146 women. And it's a good occasion to reflect on where we've come today, but the struggles that we need to remember. So I'm here to talk about the Chinese women immigrants who live in New York City. And the first thing I want to say is that women among the Chinese immigrant population were really kind of a small minority until the 1960s. It was only at that point in the 1960s that the immigration law changes after World War II, and in 1965 allowed women to join their husbands and families in the United States. And the stereotype is that the early women who were from China were from poor villages, largely uneducated, illiterate in Chinese, as well as they didn't know English, and very, very traditional. And this is somewhat true because a lot of my early union members would tell me that their husbands really didn't approve of them going into the workforce, but since the garment factories were all women workers, they felt that it was okay because they wouldn't get into trouble with other men. But even so, they would gossip and cause trouble as women. But the other thing that I wanted to say is that a lot of the women that I met, whether they were the really early ones or the ones who came in succeeding generations in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, have an element of being very spunky, adventurous, and even rebellious. Not unlike the 1909 and 1910 young women who were involved in those strikes and uprising of that time. And they really reflect in many ways the worldwide changes that were going on in the status of women. I mean, I have to say that even my grandmother had bound feet, but then when you look down past that generation to my mom and to others, women were really becoming much more modern and really fighting for and speaking up and getting a lot of their rights. So in Chinatown, very parallel in some ways to the 1909 uprising of the 20,000, there were more than 20,000 Chinese garment workers in the height of the production industry in New York in the 1970s and 80s. And this has dropped off precipitously because of globalization and outsourcing, but there are still several thousand Chinese workers in the garment industry today. In 1982, there was a really major labor dispute which resulted in a strike in Chinatown during the course of contract negotiations. And we had what you would call kind of a Asian American labor heroine at that time named Katie Kwan, who worked in the factories for 5 to 10 years at that point and is now a director of labor studies at UC Berkeley. But she also became the first international union officer of the ILGWU and then Unite Here. And she's written an account of the strike when she was still working in the shop. So I wanted to read you some short passages from her account. First of all, to talk about what it was like to work in the Chinatown garment factory at the time. She says, hours were long and pay was low. Wages were calculated by piece rate, where each sewing operation was assigned a price, and the more you sewed, the more you earned. Each time a new style was introduced, which might be more than twice a day, the employers tried to set prices as low as they could. If the price was too low, workers would complain, and sometimes fierce shouting matches would take place. Life was a battle as piece rate workers negotiated real earnings on a daily basis. And these were union shops, and so they were entitled to speak up and to fight for a better piece rate. But it was still that kind of a piece rate system. So Katie says, I call the piece rate system the system of being both the slave and the slave driver. You're the slave because you're the one doing the work, but you're also the slave driver because you force yourself to work faster and faster, believing that the more pieces you sew, the more money you earn, which is the reality of working piece rate. The most effective way of getting the boss to increase our piece rate was to all stop working until a fair price was negotiated. But such work stoppages were hard to organize. And I have to say, Katie did organize work stoppages to increase piece rates. And I know from a lot of the activists that came out of the 1982 strikes, many of them did too, because in the old factories, there was one switch that controlled the electricity to all the machines. And once the workers decided among themselves they were going to stop work, someone would pull the switch. And then the boss would have to come around and say, okay, what do you want? So. And they assumed, because they were Chinese owners and their workers were Chinese, that these women workers would be obedient and that there would be some ethnic loyalty that would help hold them to the boss stronger than they were held to the union. Well, they were badly mistaken, thankfully, and the union was successful in getting these workers to walk off the job into two major rallies in June of 1982 after the contract had expired and these employers had refused to sign. So I just want to read another short passage from Katie about what it was like to go into a big rally in Columbus Park in Chinatown on a hot June day. And she says that was a hot and humid New York June morning. But even 2 hours before the rally was scheduled to begin, thousands of workers began streaming into Columbus Park, fanning themselves to keep cool and waiting patiently. By the time the rally began, there were nearly 20,000 Chinatown garment workers crammed into the park, all wearing union hats and carrying picket signs. It was an exhilarating moment. Thousands upon thousands of Chinese immigrant women garment workers had come together to stand up for themselves. This was a day I had dreamed for, and this rally proved that it could be done. The rally demonstrated the power of the union, and for the next few days, the union began to break the bargaining impasse by ignoring the Chinatown Contractors Association and instead getting individual Chinese contractors to sign pledges that they would sign the union contract. Most contractors signed pledges, but several dozen held out. The union planned another big rally at Columbus Park for June 29th, that's 5 days later, and at the end of that rally, any contractor who had not signed a pledge would be struck. Once again, nearly 20,000 workers showed up at the rally, but within hours, the few shops that were put on strike caved in and signed the pledge, and the strike was won. So this was a pretty glorious history for us in Chinatown of the garment workers uniting and supporting these rallies. And I was there at the two rallies, so I have to say it was really exciting and inspirational. So what happened after 1982? And by now, 1982 is like eons ago. I've been reading a recent book about the Protocols of Peace written by Richard Greenwald. It's called The Triangle Fire, The Protocols of Peace and Industrial Democracy in Progressive Era New York. Long title. But one of the things that struck me was that even in 1909, and this is an issue probably that we as women have to kind of look at and see what's behind this. where they commented that garment workers were emotional strikers, but disinterested unionists. One ILG organizer put it this way: the greatest stumbling block is the indifference of their own union members. And I have to say that after the 1982 strike, which really galvanized the support of the members, the Chinese members of the union had to work very, very hard to build out a lot of programs and ways to engage these women workers with the union and to continue the fight for their rights. And I think that there are women's ways of organizing that enabled us to do that successfully. After the strike, the union held a lot of special shop representative classes, new members classes, took Chinese women to the labor women's summer schools, had health and safety inspections and trainings, fire drills, and the commemoration of the fire, which happened every year that we brought members to. We also had a lot of educational, cultural, and social programs, from a Chinese chorus and English classes to trips, and sometimes the trips were to Washington, D.C. for a rally, and so on. And then we had a lot of community labor projects and alliances, including supporting the building of 2 daycare centers, senior programs. We had another march of 20,000 against the building of a jail in Chinatown, affordable housing, voter registration, and so on. So these brought together a really lively group of workers who are now retiring, and unfortunately many passing away now, but who came out of that strike into the community and into union activism. I also came to do a lot of labor friendship work with China, because we were almost posed with this question that Chinatown had to compete with working conditions and prices in China. And we also had many new immigrants who came to the United States from China with very new habits and different viewpoints towards the union and towards their situation at work. It was not an uncommon practice for employers to hold back weeks or even months of wages before they paid the workers, because they assumed the workers all had savings kind of socked away and they didn't need to get paid on time. And we were seeing problems like that in our union shops. And it was just a horrific problem that involved us with the Labor Department and, you know, continuing to educate workers and trying to pull them together to fight for their rights. And then workers would tell me they were afraid that if they complained, their shop would go out of business and they would just lose their job entirely. And unfortunately, this was a reality, because by the time a big, huge bill of tens of thousands of dollars had piled up with wages, it was pretty much the norm that when we got the complaints and we went to Labor Department and we filed against the boss, that the boss would just close down. Maybe he would pay it back, or maybe he would just try to hide and run away. So the last kind of sad chapter was the tragedy of September 11th, because after the September 11th and the World Trade Center, you know, and the attacks, the Chinatown garment industry ended up in the frozen zone for many months after September 11th. And so even the delivery of work in and out of Chinatown became impossible. And so many of the factories closed, and many of them never were able to reopen because of that. So workers became displaced. There were many new training programs. Many of the workers have now gone into home care, and even to become domestic workers, which will be our next speaker, hospitality, restaurants, and food service. And one big irony I found is, as I've run into a lot of these workers who are now in new jobs after September 11th, they have a lot of nostalgia for the garment industry, even though they complained and they fought and they had really tough conditions during the time that they were working in the factory. And some of it is because the factory, for better or worse, was a very social environment where people supported each other, shared the work, and worked together. And now many of them, especially in home care, are in, you know, one person's home, and, you know, it's a very, very different working environment. So working women's lives and the struggles continue today, and I'm very inspired to be here to share this opportunity to really look at how women workers should continue to unite and fight together for our rights going into the future. Thank you very much.